Okay, so before moving forward with tracing the different layers of the stencils, I wanted to give you guys a heads up. I did my marker plan on a piece of cardstock, and it is way too thick to be able to see through to trace. So I had to retrace my project on a piece of tracing paper. So if you have tracing paper at home, you could certainly do that, like instead of doing the marker piece on paper, if you're planning on doing stencils for this. Otherwise, you could also try parchment paper, or if you use thin paper, you might be just fine. I just happen to use like a thick, like oak tag piece of paper for my marker piece, and it's just way too dark for me to be able to see to trace through it. So here is my piece transferred onto a piece of tracing paper, and now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to align each of the pieces of cardstock that I have for making my stencils, okay, up with the tracing paper. So I did keep it so the registration would work, so the edges of all of my cardstock match up with the edges of the new tracing paper as well. Okay, so now I'm just tracing around all of the dark values and only the dark values. As I trace, I'm just trying to follow the contours very carefully. Okay, so I just finished tracing all of the darks. So now I'm going to move on to the middle values, and I'm going to trace all of those. Again, I have my paper in registration with my the tracing that I did, so I'm able to trace it on the window, and so I can clearly see the new papers over top, and now I can see to trace the middle values. Okay, so I just finished up tracing the red. And now I have green, and then I also have like a white highlight yet. So I'm going to trace those two next. So I'm going to trace the green next, and then I'll trace the white after that. So I actually have 4 layers of stencils, but I'm probably going to ditch one of those come time to make the piece, and I'll explain that. Okay, so I just want to, again, match up my registration, making sure that the edges are all lined up before I start. And then I am labeling these stencils too. So this one I'm just going to label like mid green for myself, so that way I have that recorded. And then I'll show you how I'm going to break them down and cut them out. So I did want to make you aware of one other tip while I was tracing, something that I do besides labeling it. So I have Midtone Green written up here. You probably can't see that real well on the camera, but I just traced all of the green areas. So that's like this area here, like the darker green. And I also sometimes shade those areas in, just like roughly here. So I remember what I'm supposed to be getting rid of versus what I'm supposed to be keeping and masking as I use that stencil. That can be really helpful before we move on to the next step, which is going to be designing the stencils so they function. There's going to be some problems with this one in particular that I'm going to resolve in the next stage with you, but I can already see that there's some like islands that are going to need bridges, and so I have a plan, I have some ideas in mind, but just so that way it's less confusing when I move on to the next step, I actually just took some graphite and I just kind of shaded this whole shape of green in, and this whole shape of green in here, this one here, which you can see on my marker piece over here. You can see the green. So I shaded that in just to make it less confusing in the next step. Okay, so now I'm ready to go ahead and outline and trace my highlight areas. So that's here, and then there's some spots out here over the drapery part that are that lighter area too. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put my cardstock down, making sure that it is in registration with the edges of the thing that I'm tracing, okay, of my, my little plan there. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to outline all of these light areas. So again, I highly suggest putting, I'm just going to put like lights here to label it for myself. And then as you trace each shape, just kind of quickly, roughly like shade it in for yourself. It'll just make it easier come time to like work out the design and then cut it, to know like what it is that you're aiming to kind of like cut out in those areas.